Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to week 2 of our remote classes for our English class, and I hope that everything's going well for you, not just in terms of how work is going in this class, but also in other classes and in your personal lives too. I know that it can be frustrating when plans are upset in the way that they have been this semester, and I know that it can be very stressful, and hopefully you've been in contact with your other professors and everything's going good there. Hopefully you still feel that everything's going good with this class, and if not, please email me, let me know. And I hope that everybody is doing all right in spite of everything. So I want to start out today by talking about where we left off on last week. If you'll remember, we were talking about how you can take a whole lot of separate arguments and use them to reinforce each other in order to make a larger, more persuasive, more powerful, overarching argument. And one of the examples that we looked at was the example of Mark Antony's funeral oration in the play Julius Caesar. And we saw that really, even though it's just one speech and it's just one argument, why it was wrong to murder Caesar, we were able to break down that speech and see, well, really, he's making 3 or more individual arguments to reinforce that argument. He had a logos-based argument where he was looking at all of Caesar's past actions and saying, the assassins are saying that Caesar was ambitious, but here's evidence from the past that he wasn't. That in itself would have been a good argument. He also made an ethos-based argument saying Brutus, the lead assassin, says he's an honorable man, he says he's a just man, but here's all these reasons that he's not. That argument as well would have been good on its own as a separate argument. But what Mark Antony, or I guess Shakespeare, does in that play is that he takes all these separate arguments and he synthesizes them to make a more powerful overall argument. This is something that happens a lot in persuasive writing and argumentative essays. If it's not something that's happening in the text that you've chosen to analyze for this assignment, it's certainly something that you'll see in other writings, either this semester or later on, or maybe you've already seen it before. Authors will very rarely just have their one main idea and not elaborate on that or expand on that. Otherwise, you wouldn't have essays or books. You would just have the thesis statement and that's it. But usually, authors will like to take that thesis statement and approach it from different angles, so they can prove that what they're saying is true or good from an ethos-based perspective, and then over here from a logos-based perspective. Maybe it won't be strictly along the lines of pathos, logos, ethos. That's just how it happened to be with the example that we looked at. But there's multiple ways to make the same argument, and a good persuasive essay will incorporate all of those ways into the essay so that they leave really no room for doubt. And this doesn't just happen in terms of argumentation either. It also is true in terms of what sort of evidence that an essay will use, or what sort of sources that it will cite. Not so much in this class, but definitely in English 102. When you take that class, they're going to talk a lot about incorporating other writers, other voices into your argument through means of citations, through means of sources. You'll be writing annotated bibliographies, things like that. And one of the advantages of doing this is because it increases your own ethos appeal to your argument. So say, for example, you're writing an argumentative or persuasive essay on the topic of, medicine. There's some sort of medicine controversy that you want to explore and that you want to pick a side on. You're a college student. Your own authority isn't that weighty in the matter, regardless of what side you come down on the question. But when you incorporate articles and writings of other people in the field who do have an established reputation, who do have a history of knowing what they're talking about when it comes to that, and you use their citations to back up your point, that increases your own credibility. It's kind of like borrowing the credibility from somebody else and using it as your own. But it's a way to increase your own ethos. And when we come to talking about utilizing multiple sources, it's the same thing that we were talking about in terms of utilizing multiple different arguments or subtopics. You have to bring them all together in order to support your main idea. You don't want to have an essay where you introduce a whole lot of different voices, writers, and at the end of the day, it reads like you were just repeating what they were saying in some sort of scheme or order. You want to make sure that the sources that you borrow or take from and include in your own writing are there for a purpose, that they're there to support your argument, what you're trying to get across. And this brings us to an idea, or the idea of synthesis. Now, synthesis, in the literary terms of it, is the idea of taking separate parts, separate units, whether it be arguments or subtopics or different sources, and combining them to create a new idea or a new thought. It's not just a conglomeration of the multiple old ones, it's multiple old ones coming together to make something new. And that's really the, I think, long-term goal of studying or learning anything. You're taking in all of this knowledge from other writers, from essays, books, things that you read online, and you're retaining all of that. But it's only really worthwhile when you take what you've learned and are able to shift it and use it to make your own original statements, your own original contributions. So there's a balance when it comes to learning between study and production. And that's why, if you remember at the start of the term, we sort of went over the 4 major writing assignments that we were going to do for this class. And I said projects 1 and projects 4 are you guys creating something of your own. You're making a thesis-driven narrative. You're making whatever you decide to work on for project 4. Those 2 are creatively oriented, but the middle 2 were analytically oriented in that you were looking at the ideas of other creators, other writers, whether it be the media analysis or the textual analysis. And this is so that you can take in those new ideas and use them for your own purposes and for your own essays later on in the future. So it is important to strike that balance. It's important to keep the idea of synthesis in mind and for the future, what it is, what it means. Just remember, it's the combination of separate parts to come up with a new idea or theory or argument. And like I said, this will be important for English 102 because in that class, just to kind of give you a spoiler, you're going to be doing a research paper. And in that research paper, you're going to be developing your own thesis statement, your own argument that you're going to be covering, and then you're going to go find different sources that will support the statement that you're making. And it's easy when you do that, and I've seen this happen in the past, to find 8 or 10 different sources, however many it's going to be, and just list those sources in the research paper and say something like, source A says this, source B says this, and so on for a couple of pages, and then you conclude by restating your own thesis statement at the top. It's not a great example of a research paper because it's not really making a connection between your sources and your own statement. You want to have an idea of how to synthesize all that information that you're taking from those sources in order to make it seem like, or not to make it seem like, in order so that your thesis statement blends completely in with what they're saying too. So with that in mind, I want to look at some of the some examples from 2 essays from the textbook, and I'm going to give you the page numbers. Actually, I'll give you the page numbers on Blackboard. I meant to say this at the beginning of the lecture, but I'll send you guys out an email about it too. I'm planning on updating the syllabus to reflect this new schedule here soon. So don't worry right now about whether or not you've missed a couple of readings or something. If there's any new readings that I want you to do, it will be in that new syllabus, which I'll put out here shortly. But with that being said, for this week, I do want you to take a look, when you have time, at two essays from the back of the Everyone's an Author textbook. One of them is called World and Screen by a guy named Nicholas Carr. And the other one is, let me get there, where are you? Mind Over Mass Media by Steven Pinker. And I had those two readings assigned together on the old syllabus too. So the page numbers are still there. You can go and find those. But I want to just look at them as examples in this lecture today of how a writer will borrow sources, ideas from past writers in order to support their argument. So the first essay, World and Screen by Nicholas Carr. Now Nicholas Carr is known for being, I guess you could say, a critic of new technologies. Being a critic of the way that the world's changing. He's well known for an essay that he wrote called Is Google Making Us Stupid?, which I've actually taught in another one of my classes, and it's a good essay. I think it's available for free online. If you're interested in that and you want to read it, you can definitely look into it. But the title of that essay kind of gives you a sense of what sort of a thinker he is. Yes, he's arguing that Google is making us stupid. But in this particular essay, World and Screen, he's focused on how GPS systems are changing the way that our brains work, how they're kind of harming the way that we perceive the world and making it so that we're isolated from our environment and our surroundings as opposed to connected to it. So read this essay. I'm going to read a few quotes to you out of it right now. And these are quotes where Carr relies on other authors, where he relies on sources to support his own main idea. So at the top of page 891, he's going on about how GPSs end up isolating us from the environment. And he says, as a team of Cornell University researchers put it in a 2008 paper, with the GPS, you no longer need to know where you are and where your destination is, attend to physical landmarks along the way, or get assistance from other people in the car and outside of it. The automation of wayfinding serves to inhibit the process of experiencing the physical world by navigation through it. So you can see that he's using this 2008 paper from Cornell University to back up what he's saying. He does this again later on. On the next page, he says, a British study found that drivers using paper maps developed stronger memories of routes and landmarks than did those relying on turn-by-turn instructions from satellite systems. So when you think about how technology has changed the way that we do things just over the past 10, 20 years or so, before, if you were going on vacation across the country somewhere, I remember this from when I was younger, you would have to have the great big unfolding maps of whatever state that it was you were passing through that would be sold in the gas stations. And you'd have to unfold the maps and find what interstate you were on and trace your finger up it to know which exits you had to take. And you always had to be on the lookout for those exits too. So those big green signs you gotta keep an eye on, because if you miss your turn, that could make you have another extra hour added on to your trip. But with GPSs, whether it be the ones that you mount up on the dashboard or even the ones that you use in your phone, that's the ones that I use. With those, you don't really have to pay attention to those exits anymore. You don't have to be aware of what road you're on as much anymore. You just have to keep your ear open for when the GPS voice says turn left here, and then you make that turn. So that's the point that he's making. He's saying that GPSs have made it so that our brains don't have to function so much when we're driving. And he's quoting another study, that British study, to support that point. And yeah, he wraps up this thought again by quoting other people. If you have a mobile phone with Google Maps, says Michael Jones, an executive in Google's mapping division, you can go anywhere on the planet and have confidence that we can give you directions to get where you want to go safely and easily. No human ever has to feel lost again. So he takes that quote, and keep in mind that that sounds like this person, Michael Jones, is talking about it like it's a good thing. Say, you never have to worry about getting lost again. This is great. But he takes that quote and uses it for his own purposes. He uses it as evidence for his own argument, because right below, Carr says, the more you think about it, the more you realize that to never confront the possibility of getting lost is to live in a state of perpetual dislocation. If you never have to worry about not knowing where you are, then you never have to know where you are. It is also to live in a state of dependency, a ward of your phone and its apps. So, oh yeah, that's interesting too. At the very end, he asks a question, and this is a rhetorical strategy too, and it's something that you might want to think about in your own writings. He directly asks his audience a question. He says, what we should be asking ourselves is, how far from the world do we want to retreat? So he ends kind of in the same way that, did we watch the short clip by George Lucas in class, the A Look at Life one, where it was just the images flashing by really quickly and the loud music, and then it slowed down? If you remember that clip, it ended with this sort of rhetorical question, anyone for survival? And then it had the question mark, and then it faded to black ominously. It kind of has the same impact in this essay. Carr is putting it in the reader's hands. He's saying, here's the evidence. I've laid it all down. Now what do you want to do with this evidence? It's up to you. The other essay by Steven Pinker, I didn't fold the page on that one very well. Here it is. These two essays are interesting to read side by side because the two authors are in complete disagreement about the way that technology is affecting our minds, influencing the ways that we think. And Pinker's essay seems to directly address some of the points that Carr brings up. And so Carr is actually a source that Pinker uses. But they disagree. So Steven Pinker's argument is that we don't have to worry about technology changing the way that we think because our minds are just as adaptable as the technologies are. They use what's given to them. They use what's there at the time. And so there's no real conflict there. It says knowledge is increasing exponentially. And so we have to have more advanced technologies to keep up with that increase of knowledge. And we can actually know more with that technology than we would be able to know without it. Which in a way is true. I think his basic argument is that back in the day, if you wanted to find out about some obscure fact, you would have to do research in a library or pull down a volume from an encyclopedia set, flip through the alphabetical order of it, and find this thing, whatever it was you were looking for, and look it up. Whereas now, the answer to just about any question you have, all you got to do is just type it into Google search, and there it is. So there's this unbelievable repository of information in your phones that's at your disposal that you didn't have before. But Pinker begins his argument, his essay, by referring, again, not just to other sources, but to events in the past. He says when comic books were accused of turning juveniles into delinquents in the 1950s, crime was falling to record lows, just as the denunciation of video games in the 1990s coincided with the great American crime decline. The decades of television, transistor radios, and rock videos were also decades in which IQ scores rose continuously. So he's making those comparisons to show that the sorts of criticism that somebody like Nicholas Carr would make is nothing new. That this isn't some unprecedented thing where we have this new technology that we don't know what it's doing to our brains. It's always been that way. Before it was the cell phones and the GPS devices, it was people worried about video games. And before that, it was people worried about comic books. And that goes all the way back into ancient times. when the printing press started mass producing books, they were worried that it was going to somehow cheapen knowledge, that only handwritten books were a good thing, and so on. Then Pinker goes on to talk about people like Nicholas Carr. He says, critics of new media sometimes use science itself to press their case, citing research that shows how experience can change the brain. But cognitive neuroscientists roll their eyes at such talk. Yes, every time we learn a fact or skill, the wiring of the brain changes. It's not as if the information is stored in the pancreas, but the existence of neuroplasticity does not mean the brain is a blob of clay pounded into shape by experience. Now, he uses that term neuroplasticity, and the reason that I want to pull this quote out is because that's the same term that Carr uses. If not in the World and Screen essay, he uses it in the Is Google Making Us Stupid essay. So Pinker is directly engaging with Carr and his ideas in this essay of his. And he's bringing in other sources too, other quotes. He says, as the psychologists Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simmons show in their new book, The Invisible Gorilla and Other Ways Our Intuitions Deceive Us, the effects of experience are highly specific to the experiences themselves. And he goes on to talk about this study that they did in their book. So it's interesting, like I said before, to read those two essays together, and I hope that you do, because you can see that even though clearly they're not in the same room with each other and they don't even agree with each other, they are having a conversation. And that's another advantage that I would point out to utilizing multiple sources in your own research writing, because when you do so, it doesn't make it seem so much like you're just writing a paper or an essay that's only your thoughts and nothing else. You don't want somebody to pick up your essay and read it and make it seem like you are writing that in isolation. You want to make it seem like your essay was just one essay in a larger arena of other essays that are all talking about the same topic, engaging with each other, arguing with each other, things like that. So, let me find my place here real quick. Sorry about that. I just kind of lost my place in my notes there. But yeah, those two essays are good examples when you read them of how an author incorporates other voices into their argument. Or, yeah, like I said at the beginning, you don't even have to do that. You could be incorporating multiple arguments of your own in that essay, but it helps. It makes you seem more credible when you're showing that you've researched your topic, whatever that topic may happen to be. Another thing that is revealed in the Carr and in the Pinker essays is that oftentimes you will be reading something that somebody wrote, whether it's a book or an essay, and you'll notice that they have a bias. Nicholas Carr clearly has a bias against technology and Steven Pinker's bias is for technology. This doesn't necessarily mean that those are bad essays. I've seen in the past students who will think about using an essay for one of their sources for a research paper, and because they identify the bias, think that it's not a good essay to use. Just because an essay has bias doesn't mean that it's a bad essay. In fact, you're going to find very few, if any, essays that have no point of view, no position that they're supporting. Otherwise, why would they be writing, right? Everybody has something to say and everybody thinks that they're right. So seeing bias in an essay doesn't mean it's a bad essay. It just means that you should be able to identify it and then place that bias within the proper context of your own argument. So for example, if you're writing a pro-technology essay, a pro-Google essay, and you're thinking about using the Nicholas Carr piece as a source, you could say, well, he's clearly got a bias against technology, but I can still use this essay. I just have to keep in mind what his bias is so that I can use it in the proper context of my own argument. And also keep in mind that you have biases too, since we're talking about bias. I've always been the sort of person who does a better job, this is just me personally, who does a better job of reading a text and engaging with a text when I disagree with it. Because I like to annotate when I read. You should annotate when you read. I used to be against it, but it's helpful in a number of ways. Let me find a good example here. Where's that essay at? So you can see in the pinker essay, I've got a whole bunch of writing in the margins there, a whole bunch of underlines and arrows pointing to passages that I think are important. That's my way of engaging with the text. So it's not so much me sitting there staring at a piece of paper with words on it. It's me having a conversation with that author. I can write in the margins where, yes, I agree with this point that he's making right here, or no, I don't agree with that point that he's making down there. And in the margins I can write why I agree or why I disagree. Well, my annotations in the margins of essays are usually more prevalent when I'm disagreeing with something that I'm reading, because I'm more critical of the argument and I'm finding more things to talk about in my annotations. So when you're going to read an essay, and if you find that you disagree with something that the author is saying, that's a bias on your part, but it's good when you recognize it to stick with it, to still engage with that author. Don't read the first couple sentences, realize that you're not going to agree with what they're saying, and then just put the book down, or the essay down, or whatever it is. That's when you can really, kick your brain into high gear, or whatever analogy you want to use, and start underlining points that the author's making. See if you can poke holes in that argument, because that not only allows you to engage with a text that you otherwise might not want to give the time of day, but it also makes it so that you can either, one, strengthen your own position by confirming that that author doesn't know what they're talking about and you've just proved it, or two, change your mind about something. And that'll happen often too. Maybe the author will present their argument in a way that you hadn't thought about before, or maybe they'll give you new information that you didn't know was there before, and then you've actually learned something new, which is always a good thing. So bias, either in the authors that you're reading or in yourself when you're reading those authors, isn't always a bad thing. It's only bad when you refuse to acknowledge it in yourself, or when you sometimes miss it or don't perceive it in the authors that you're reading. Once it's acknowledged, it's a good thing if you know how to use it properly. Another last thing that I would point out, especially with these two essays when you read them, because they do cite research, they use terms that are specific to their field, like neuroplasticity, is learning the language of the author that you're reading is always a good thing too. Sometimes writers will use words in a specific way that aren't usually used that way outside of their essay. So you want to make sure that you're not missing the point of what they're saying because you're not picking up on how they're using this word in a specific way. What's the name of the essay? There's an essay that we read in one of my other classes, in my critical reading class, called On Being a Cripple, and it's by Nancy Mayers, I believe. I'll have to look it up to make sure. But she's writing from her experience of being handicapped, and she takes the term cripple, and wears it as a sort of badge of honor. She likes the acknowledgement that she's had sort of a tough time, but she's been able to overcome that. So in that essay, when she uses the word cripple, she's using it respectfully. But outside of that essay, it's a word that's frequently used as an insult or in some derogatory way that you wouldn't say. But keeping in mind the way that she's using it, it's easy to read that essay and understand what she's talking about. Whereas if you picked up the essay and did skip the first couple of paragraphs where she explained why she was using that word in the specific way, you might think, oh wow, what's her problem? Why is she saying it like this? That's just one example. And I think that is all that I wanted to have covered for today. This week, keep in mind that rough drafts of Project 3 are due. They're due on Wednesday, so go ahead and submit those to Blackboard like you normally would, and I'll get them back to you soon, probably before the end of the weekend. And I'm always afraid I'm going to forget something, but I think that's it. So, thanks for listening. Hopefully, this is still working out well for everyone. Maybe you're not exactly sitting there glued to the screen. I understand that, but if you can just have this lecture playing in the background while you're doing something else, you'll be able to get the main idea of some of the stuff that we would have talked about in class anyway. And yeah, I hope everything is still going well. So, that's all I've got for today. Everybody have a good week. Let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget to respond to the Writer's Diary prompts in Blackboard underneath this video link. And also don't forget that the discussion boards are still a thing. Keep doing those. And I will see you all later.